I went over to borrow something small from my neighbor. Flour, maybe sugar. Instead, she opened a door in her cellar I always assumed was a closet. Jars, crocks, sacks stacked to the ceiling. None of it bought that week. None of it needing a truck or a power line to survive. I've got a pantry of store cans I call my prepper stash. And standing there, it felt like a stage prop. One shelf did something mine couldn't do, and I didn't understand what until she explained it. This isn't about running out and buying more Amish-style goods at the store. It's about noticing that her pantry runs on independence, and mine runs on inventory. My cabinet can hold more calories than hers and still be more fragile, because almost everything in it depends on a truck showing up, a power line staying connected, or a store shelf staying open. Here are 7 things she showed me that quietly exposed what my own stockpile can't survive without. And the very last thing she showed me wasn't even food. Number 7. The sack of wheat berries in the corner. I assumed it was backup flour, sitting there for whenever we ran low. It wasn't flour at all. It was whole wheat berries, sealed tight in a bucket, sitting in the corner like they weren't in any particular hurry to be used. That distinction sounds small. It isn't. The moment wheat gets milled into flour, a clock starts ticking. Flour goes rancid in weeks to a few months because milling cracks open the grain's outer layer and exposes the oils inside the germ to air. Whole berries, left intact and sealed properly, can sit for 30 years and still mill into good, usable flour. That is not a minor gap in shelf life. That is the difference between a pantry item and an entire pantry system. Here's the mistake most people make without noticing. Shoppers stock the finished product instead of the raw one. They fill the cabinet with bags of flour, rotate the best buy date, and feel prepared because the shelf looks full. Meanwhile, a sealed bin of whole grain sitting in a cool corner doesn't ask for that kind of babysitting at all. She wasn't storing bread. She was storing the ability to make bread years from now, whenever she actually needs it, not just this week. Here's the home version of that mistake, and I've lived it myself. A pantry stacked with flour that's already lost its rise and its flavor by the time anyone reaches for it in an emergency. I even own a hand-crank mill attachment I bought 2 years ago and have used exactly 0 times. The tool was never the missing piece. The mindset was, if you're going to store a grain-based calorie source at all, buy the grain, not just the ground version sitting in a paper bag. A mill is a one-time purchase. Grain that can outlive a decade in your basement is not something you're going to get from the flour aisle. But grain alone doesn't cook itself, and it definitely doesn't feed a family on its own. The next shelf she opened showed me what actually makes stored food worth eating at all. Number 6. A whole shelf of rendered fat, no bottles in sight. I've got 3 half-used bottles of vegetable oil sitting in my own cabinet. She had rows of jars packed with solid white fat, and none of them were under any kind of expiration pressure at all. That's home-rendered lard, and it doesn't behave anything like the bottled oil most of us default to without thinking twice. Here's the shelf signal worth watching in your own kitchen. Bottled seed oils go rancid faster than most people assume, and almost nobody stockpiles them in bulk, because oil doesn't feel like real pantry food. It feels like a background condiment, something you grab without checking. But strip the fat out of a pantry, and everything else on the shelf turns into flavorless filler. Flour, rice, and beans without fat just make food that doesn't taste like much of anything, and food nobody wants to eat twice doesn't actually get eaten at all. That's a consequence people rarely think through until they're staring at a pot of plain rice for the 3rd night in a row, wondering why nobody in the house wants seconds. Home-rendered lard, made and stored properly, holds 2 to 6 months at room temperature, well over a year in the fridge, and years in the freezer. That's longer and more stable than most people expect from something that never touched a factory line. And she didn't buy any of it at a store. She made it. From pork fat most households would have thrown straight in the trash without a second thought. This is easy to overlook because fat isn't dramatic. It's the last thing anyone adds to a stockpile list, tucked in after the more exciting items. Keep at least one long-lasting traditional fat in the house and learn how to render it yourself instead of only ever buying it pre-bottled. Grain and fat together get you calories. The next room she opened was about something that doesn't need a truck, a delivery window, or a power grid at all. Number 5, a root cellar that never needed a refrigerator. I pictured my own fridge, crammed with produce that quietly turns the moment I forget about it for a week. She had potatoes and cabbage that had been sitting in that cellar for months, completely untouched by any compressor or power line. Here's the mistake most modern shoppers make without ever realizing it. We assume fresh food is automatically fragile food. It isn't. It's fragile mostly because we've lost the old rules for keeping it properly. Potatoes, kept dark, and somewhere around 40 to 50 degrees, last 4 to 6 months without any special equipment. Cabbage, kept cool and near freezing, holds 3 to 6 months the same way. That's not a special building buried in the backyard. That's a cool closet or a shaded basement corner, managed with a little bit of attention. But there's a twist even inside that seemingly simple system. Store an apple too close to those potatoes, and the apple's ethylene gas will make the potatoes sprout weeks early. One shelf over from the wrong fruit, and the whole arrangement quietly fails. She wasn't fighting spoilage in that cellar at all. She was managing conditions, and managing conditions costs nothing but a little attention and the right layout. The home consequence of not knowing any of this is a family throwing out potatoes and cabbage almost every week, assuming that's simply how vegetables behave in a normal kitchen, never realizing the same food could have lasted an entire season with a slightly different setup. Watch what actually happens at your own grocery store around harvest season. Bulk bags of potatoes and cabbage show up cheap for a short window, and most shoppers walk right past them because they picture their own crisper drawer turning that produce to mush within a week. That's the shelf signal worth remembering. The produce isn't the fragile part. The storage habit is. Pick one cool, dark spot somewhere in your own house, whether it's a closet on an exterior wall or a corner of an unfinished basement, and figure out which 2 or 3 vegetables actually thrive there without ever touching a refrigerator. You don't need a dugout root cellar with a dirt floor to get most of the benefit. Vegetables can wait months this way, quietly, without costing you a single kilowatt. But the next shelf held something people insist has to be used within days no matter what. Number 4. Mason jars of meat, already cooked, already safe. My own canned meat is small, pricey tins I grab whenever they happen to be on sale. Hers was quart jars, home-processed, sitting 2 and 3 deep on the shelf like running out was never something she had to plan around. Here's the shelf signal worth watching at your own grocery store. Canned meat is often the first affordable protein to quietly thin out the moment demand spikes, leaving behind only the pricier tins or the smaller, less useful sizes. The category still looks present from a distance. The useful, affordable format is already gone by the time anyone notices. That's a pattern worth remembering the next time a shelf looks fine at a passing glance. What she has instead isn't a shopping solution at all. It's a skill and equipment solution. Properly pressure-canned meat is commonly reported shelf-stable for 2 to 5 years, sometimes noticeably longer if the seal holds, and it needs 0 refrigeration once it's sealed in the jar. Most people never attempt this because canning meat sounds intimidating, so they default to buying it pre-canned and simply hoping the shelf stays stocked whenever they need it. One shelf of jars quietly did something an entire aisle of tiny tins couldn't. It made protein something she controlled, instead of something she had to wait on. The home consequence is simple and painfully common: a family with plenty of rice sitting in the cabinet and no real protein plan the moment those small cans finally run out. Rice and pasta without protein isn't a pantry. It's a pile of side dishes waiting on a main course that never shows up. That's the kind of thing you don't notice until you're actually standing at the stove trying to make dinner out of what's left. It's not that store cans are bad. It's that she has a second option that never depends on a shelf, a truck, or a sale price at all. A pressure canner is a one-time purchase, and once you actually learn the process, protein stops being a recurring grocery gamble every single month. You're not chasing a sale anymore. You're just refilling a system you already control. Protein solved. But the next thing she showed me solved a problem I didn't even know I had. What happens when the power goes out and simply doesn't come back on? Number 3. A crock of eggs that don't need a fridge. I asked her, half joking, what would happen to my own eggs if the power stayed off for a month straight. She didn't answer with words. She just pointed at a covered crock sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Refrigeration is the single point of failure sitting behind almost every fresh protein source in a modern kitchen. No power, no eggs, no dairy, no meat. No matter how full that fridge looked the day before everything stopped. What she's using instead is called water glassing. Fresh, unwashed eggs submerged in a pickling lime solution, a technique that's been used since the 1800s, back when refrigeration simply didn't exist yet as an option. Done properly, those eggs hold safely at room temperature for 12 to 18 months without ever touching a compressor. She wasn't beating the shelf life of eggs at all. She was beating the need for a fridge entirely. Most people never stockpile eggs in any form because they assume eggs are inherently short-lived by nature. That's really only true once they've been refrigerated and never treated any other way in their entire life. And the ingredient that makes the whole method work isn't rare or expensive at all. It's pickling lime, sitting quietly in the same aisle as canning supplies that most shoppers walk right past without a glance. The home consequence here is a family sitting on a fully stocked pantry of shelf-stable calories, with no real way to put together an actual breakfast the moment the eggs and milk in the fridge finally run out. If you want to try this yourself, start small with a batch of farm-fresh eggs before assuming ordinary store eggs will behave exactly the same way. Eggs without a fridge, meat without a truck. But the next thing on her shelf didn't come from a store at all. It came from nothing but flour, water, and time. Number 2. A jar that's been alive longer than some of her kids. I keep a couple of yeast packets tucked in my freezer just in case. She pointed at a jar of bubbling starter that's been fed daily for years and has never once come from a store shelf. This is exactly where the whole list quietly shifts under your feet. Everything up to this point has been about storing enough of something. This is about not needing to restock at all, ever again. Commercial yeast is a manufactured, trucked-in product, and when it disappears from shelves, bread making stops cold for anyone depending on the little foil packet. That's not a hypothetical scare story. Back in 2020, commercial yeast vanished from grocery shelves across the entire country, and sourdough starters, needing nothing but flour, water, and regular feeding, became the workaround that kept home bakers in fresh bread for months, while the shelves stayed empty. A packet of yeast is something you buy once and use straight up. A starter is something you never have to buy again, because it isn't consumed the way a packet is. It's renewed every time you feed it. People picture stockpiling yeast as simply buying more packets and stacking them in the freezer. They rarely picture a living version of yeast that reproduces itself indefinitely, sitting quietly on a kitchen counter the whole time. The home consequence without something like this is a pantry full of flour, wheat, and fat, but no real way to actually turn any of it into bread once the store-bought yeast finally runs out. Her jar has outlasted appliances, house moves, and even some of her own kids moving out on their own. Start a starter now, while flour and yeast are both still easy to find on a normal shelf, not during the middle of the next shortage. Grain, fat, vegetables, protein, eggs, bread. 6 pieces of a system that mostly runs on its own now. But the last thing she showed me wasn't food at all. It was the one ingredient every single shelf in that room quietly depended on the whole time. Number 1. The plain bag of salt that makes everything else possible. I figured my own salt shaker already had this fully covered. She showed me it wasn't even the same product at all. This is the item that quietly recontextualizes everything that came before it. Ordinary iodized table salt, with its anti-caking additives, isn't reliably suited for canning or true meat curing. It can cloud a brine, discolor the food inside the jar, and it simply isn't the product real preservation actually depends on. Canning salt and dedicated curing salt, the kind mixed with nitrites, are entirely different products from whatever sits in most kitchen cabinets, and curing salt in particular is something most households have never once purchased in their entire lives. Salt feels infinite and completely interchangeable, so almost nobody ever checks whether the kind they own is actually the kind that works for real preservation. That plain bag was quietly behind the canned meat 2 shelves back. It was behind the cabbage resting safely in that root cellar. It was behind the flavor in the bread slowly rising from that jar of living starter. The pantry never ran on rare or exotic ingredients. It ran on getting one common, unglamorous ingredient exactly right. Here's the consequence that actually matters most. Someone attempting to preserve their own meat or vegetables for the very first time during a real emergency, reaching for the wrong salt without realizing it, and ending up with an unsafe or completely ruined result at the exact moment it mattered the most. Check the label on your own salt today, right now if you can. Keep a dedicated bag of true canning or curing salt separate from your everyday shaker on the counter. 7 shelves, 1 connected system, and every single piece of it traced back to something she never had to buy twice. Here's how it all quietly connects once you step back and look at the whole cellar. Grain isn't food without fat behind it. Produce isn't safe without the right storage knowledge guiding it. Protein isn't secure without either canning skill or a fridge-free backup plan. Bread isn't possible without something alive to leaven it, and none of it preserved safely without the right kind of salt sitting behind all of it. A pantry isn't just a pile of separate purchases stacked on a shelf. It's a system, and one weak link quietly changes what the whole thing can actually do for your family. You don't need to copy her entire cellar by next week. Pick one single piece of this and start it this month. Start a sourdough culture on your counter. Buy a real bag of dedicated canning salt. Look seriously into a pressure canner. One small, deliberate move beats trying to rebuild her whole system overnight and burning out before you finish. None of this means you have to throw out your store cans or feel bad about the pantry you already have. A shelf of canned goods from the store is still useful. It's just not the whole system on its own. The gap isn't that modern shoppers are careless. It's that a grocery store quietly trains you to think about food as something you buy, not something you also know how to keep, cure, grow, or renew yourself. That's an easy habit to fall into, and an easy one to start closing. Her pantry wasn't bigger than mine. It was independent, and that's a completely different kind of prepared. The most resilient food system isn't the one with the most cans stacked on a shelf. It's the one that needs the grocery store the least, month after month, year after year, no matter what's happening with prices, trucks, or the power grid. So tell me down in the comments, what's one thing in your own pantry that quietly depends on the power staying on or the store staying open?